So the work of bodies were part of the cash nexus, of course. The exchange of money for caloric expenditure was at the premise of American free labor politics and both radical and conservative economic thought at the time. But the work of logging was so demanding that even with unlimited food, the workers still lost that 6 pounds, which means this nature was worked more than it was compensated. And this was an externality not kept track of on books. And I think this was a fundamentally and classically violent consequence of industrial capitalism. But when you talk about the work of the weather, particularly the cold weather and the ice roads, this could never be part of the cash nexus. No one had to pay for the benefits of the cold, nor could the cold be exhausted. And so there's no negative externalities to the use of the cold weather. And so I have this here as a statement, but I'll ask it as a question. To what extent is the cold offering a free utility that isn't a violent cause of industrial capitalism because it has no externalities? So I agree with the fundamental premise of Professor Moore's idea of the utilization of cheap nature as a fundamental part of capitalism and perhaps even industrialization, but I don't know if the nature-society division is always violent. That's it.
Okay, so we've got like 25 minutes or so for questions. So if the presenters want to come up here and take some questions. Any questions?
Were there any other characteristics that we normally would associate with industrialization, with fossil fuel-led industrialization, like concentration of capital, like sort of concentration of firms, the lack of like moving out small producers, things like that? And if we're talking about kind of less capital, I mean, do we call this less capital intensive? I guess that's a question as well. But if it is, which maybe that's part of your argument. I don't want to impute it to you. But if that's the case, then why would there be such kind of concentration? I mean, I guess we tied to the lane control, perhaps. But yeah, and were there other ways that access was restricted to entry? You imagine this seems like a situation where entry into the market wouldn't be that high, perhaps, which it wouldn't be because of the things you're using. Yeah, I was just wondering what's the other evidence for industrialization?
Yeah, okay.
Right, I think we're going to stack this.
Oh, okay.
My question is on Egypt. So, as you have mentioned, the expansion of the so-called desert frontier has created a lot of new cities around the now delta areas. But as far as I know, there's a huge number of unemployed youth population around these cities, and these cities really cause these disgruntled youth people really cause the Arab Spring, and some of them even join the terrorist organizations in the area. So, do you think that capital should further develop these cities, or should really expand these agricultural communities into larger cities? Do you think whether it is a rational choice or not?
One more, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Quick correction. I'm Jason. I think he said Anthony.
Oh, sorry.
The name. Just want to get that straight.
Sorry.
So yeah, I mean, so
Like it could be. I don't know why.
no. So I do think that logging was industrial, but just not industrial in the sense that most historians conceive of industrialization. I mean, certainly it follows many of the other patterns of industrialization in America, like the concentration of capital. But actually, my research has a lot in common with Sven's because it's predominantly smallholders, but there's a lot of debt involved when you have these smallholders doing the production. So I'm contending with a lot of the work in America on industrialization that concentrates on the factory, which is an obvious manifestation of like the concentration of capital and the industrialization of the workplace and the labor process. But when you take industrialization out into the rural area, a lot changes, and capital is concentrated, but production is spread out in a large geographic area. And so it actually looks a lot more quaint and primitive, but you know, when you look at the account books of these small operators, you see a lot of debt and you see the markings of industrial capitalism. If that answers your question.
Yeah, so in answer to your question, well, I think that's the fascinating part of the kind of what the frontier looked like in the post-independence period, is the enduring character of the frontier was a kind of repeasantization through distribution of reclaimed lands. But that in the neoliberal period developed, that became part of this state desert development plan, which is what you're talking about, where the building of these cities, and that connects actually to agriculture and food, because many of the food processing units are in these these satellite cities that were built under Mubarak. No, I mean, I think it's a spatial fix, but it's a total disaster. Yeah, it's sucking. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the land reclamation as a frontier versus kind of what we usually think of as a commodity frontier, is that it doesn't involve, it's not a typical kind of accumulation by dispossession. There are many indirect forms of displacement that are involved, and one of them is the displacement of the state budget toward reclamation, which has been huge, and funneling agricultural and other resources to these new cities and the like, industrial zones and the like, through tax breaks and yeah. So it's never going to be a fix. It's never going to resolve anything. Yeah, that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm trying to articulate this to myself. I guess I have a kind of question observation that's sort of between Jason and Marion, and I think some of Spencer fits in here too. So Pennsylvania had this enormous history of logging that's very similar. In fact, you can hike out to some just genuinely fascinating, long abandoned villages. They weren't as large as towns, up in the mountains of places that are now reclaimed after a fashion, because they're now state parklands, right? But they only became state parklands after the logging industry had essentially stripped them bare, right? And then left them abandoned, right? That included these villages, right? Way up in state parks like Tyodotton State Park, for example, where you not only have 100 men consuming the sort of calorie, but whole villages that actually included things like schools and flop houses and small churches, right? That you really have to look for the evidence, because it's long abandoned and it's now all the hemlock are gone, right? But it's grown up with scruffy-looking pine trees and maple. But there's a kind of interesting question there that I'm struggling to articulate about what reclamation means, because these were lands that were sort of reclaimed by the state, right? After it didn't look like they had any more use, right? Now we can call them recreational, right? But now the gas industry's back, right? So now there's state lands that are being re-logged, reforested, right, made into tons of deer love this edge habitat, that we still want to call reclaimed, but, and I guess here's the question. This is a dispersed industrialization, it's called, right, the gas industry, and so is the logging. But a lot of folks out where I live in rural Pennsylvania just don't see it as industrialization at all, because it's so dispersed, right? They didn't see the logging industry as industrialization because it was dispersed, right? Even when it erected this immense violence on hillsides, I mean, just obliterated the mountains in Pennsylvania, right? But even now with the gas companies back, folks still don't want to see that as industrialization, even when they're looking in the face of compressor stations, right? Which are clearly, you know, they're machinery and they're huge and they're dehydrators, right? They'll still resist that because they couldn't see the logging industry as industrialization. And they'll just be damned if they're gonna see the fracking industry as industrialization. So I just wondered what you thought about any or all of that.
Okay, yeah, also, and that's a really important question. What is reclamation? I have to define it in the book. Well, I offered kind of a partial definition, which really comes out of my research on the early modern period, because this was true in, well, this practice was true in Imperial Spain and also Ming Dynasty, of states claiming land and then conferring rights to private individuals to develop the land, which
So
is
it's not
what happening in Pennsylvania, where the state is like,
It's reclamation, they're not the same.
yeah. So I think that's kind of the but I could develop that a little bit more. But there is a way in which it's a type of dispossession from those who had used the land before. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that continues
Yeah.
in many places in just different sorts of ways when something else that can be extracted happens to be discovered.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
I have a question for Sven here. There's the left, the right side of Lake Kivu, different settlement patterns, and you explain that one has to do with Belgian colonization, the other is a UN mandate, but I'm wondering if you could say more specifically how exactly, like, sovereignty, law, and violence, and market relations worked in each of these, because that didn't quite explain why wasn't it possible in the Rwandan part if there wasn't sufficient legitimacy to use force, were there attempts to, use debt and economic relations to clear people out? What else, a little more detail on that difference would be interesting. With a specific eye to the question of sort of like economic relations versus sort of like legal and violent relations for acquiring land.
Well, the main difference is that in Rwanda, the Belgians relied more heavily on these existing structures, the African structures. These structures used violence, coercions to make these small-scale producers produce, and the state backed that some kind of violence. While in the Congo, it was more openly used by Europeans, that sort of violence. So on both sides, people were forced, but in another way. See?
And there's just greater violence on the left side of the lake, or what?
No, in a different way. On the left side in the plantation economy, it was more used by Europeans, violence. While on the right side, it was more, even when you talk to people now, it is more associated with Africans using violence. Because Belgium relied more heavily on these existing structures. So in that way, they try to circumvent this mandate structure. Because there were a lot of laws. You cannot dispossess people. You have to make sure that existing systems continue more or less. There's always a way to. And in that way, they try to avoid it. So that's a big difference.
Can I follow up on that? So, I mean, for me, like, when you see smallholders doing commodity production in the 20th century, I always think debt. Like, If the coercion isn't physical, it's, you know, there's a lot of debt, and the debt can be coercive. Did you find a lot of debt?
No, there was no debt.
Really?
No.
But taxation, that's what you're asking?
Taxation, of course, yeah. There was taxation,
So
yeah.
the locals were under pressure to,
There was taxation. They imposed head
Yeah.
taxes, hut taxes, even cattle taxes. They converted tributes into, they commodified tributes actually to increase the need for cash. So all these things, these actual economic pressures.
yeah.
Yeah, but there was no debt peonage. No, there wasn't there.
For Jason, thank you all for the nice presentations. The videos and the pictures are very familiar for me because I've been researching the origins of Finnish forest industry for years, and it was nice to see that basically they are the same. I got to see that videos from Finland too. So just to be clear, I think I got three questions. First, actually, where did all this wood go? Is it for wood industry, paper industry, sawmill industry? Maybe you can tell us more about that. And then in Finland, this kind of form of producing logs is actually the first waves of radical political views entering into the rural areas. And it's like nowadays you can actually see on the map that these are the red parts of the country. There's like a communist movement going on in the forest, so it's called forest commons. So maybe you can open up on that, what were the political views of these men working in the forest. And third thing, just shortly, you mentioned of course the debt peanuts, and it was the same thing, for example, in Finland when people were producing tar. It was based on debt relation and actually how they were paid. Was it in food or cash or what was the way that they were actually paid? Those three questions.
Yeah, so here you saw in the River Drive, by that time, almost all of it was for pulp. Pulp for making paper. But during the time I'm talking about, there's the transition from producing long lumber to producing pulp. So there was a mixture of both, depending on exactly where you were, but primarily for pulp. Which is interesting, the transition to pulp production actually requires that workers do more work, because when you have 12 or 14-foot logs, you always need a horse to move it. It's just too heavy. When you have 4-foot bolts of pulp, you can have one person move one pile in a day. So it's tremendously difficult work. That's at least what I found. The Finnish loggers are a problem in America too. Those are the radical organizers. But kind of the genesis of my dissertation was how is the logging industry in the Northeast different than the West? And so you have the radicalization of loggers kind of spurred on by Finnish and other foreign labor, but you don't have any unionization in the Northeast at all, and which I found was curious because when you research the IWW, they really started in the mines and the timberlands of the West, and so this is just one chapter in my dissertation. So not as much Finnish labor here, but more French Canadian labor coming right across the border, and those French Canadian laborers were often heavily indebted both to labor agents and to equipment sellers. So debt was a big part of production, particularly when you have these smallholders doing the production that get involved in debt with, again, tool sellers and also companies. There's a form of production called shacking, which was essentially like you had French-Canadian loggers who went into the woods and had their whole family, and this was happening into the 1950s, and were in a complete debt relationship with the paper company and ended up making no money and worked with their families, so violating child labor laws as well. And that's how a lot of this pulp was produced. And even workers fell into cycles of debt and alcoholism, which resulted in a lot of suicide among the workers, even native, like Yankee workers. So there's debt both for small contractors and for individual workers.
Any more questions? Well, it was, Neil said, I'm just
Yeah, I mean, it ties a little bit to Christian's talk this morning. I wrote a paper, published an article on these greening the desert narratives, which have, the environmental movement has, well, parts of the environmental movement have jumped on board, as well as industry and states, like the Egyptian state, but not only. Basically, the whole narrative is that what's made possible, greening of the desert, is going to become really useful in the future, with desertification, warming planet, scarcer water. So that's a movement in Australia and the U.S. And of course, one of the things I do in my research is I trace the greening the desert, Central Valley. I mean, the U.S. was really central in the development of these technologies, and I trace them in the 20th century. It really, that enabled this to happen in Egypt. But yeah, I mean, it's a false promise. Yeah. Oh, why don't I think it's ending? Because it's really, with peak oil, climate crisis, it's generated much more popularity. Yeah, the promise of the greening desert narratives. Yeah.
All right, well, we're pretty much at 3 o'clock. Maybe you could just tell us the name of your book one last time?
Oh, my name.
Since the book is published?
No, I'm still writing it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, next year.
Thank you very much. Good
Thank
presentation.
you.